would hope that by the end of today, or maybe when you get toward the end of the day when you're real hungry, you go up to people and say, may you have a meaningful fast. Because an easy fast is different than a meaningful fast, right? Sometimes easy doesn't give you any meaning, it just makes it easy. And I think somehow in modern Jewish culture we've tried to make Yom Kippur easier, but that's not really the point. Yom Kippur is supposed to be heavy. It's supposed to be a little bit draining. It's supposed to be a little bit more about what are we supposed to be getting rid of. Now, I don't know if you've thought about this, and maybe because I'm getting older and the doctor keeps having me do more things, but has anyone ever had to have a colonoscopy before? Right. Okay. So right. Okay. So what do you have to do before you get the colonoscopy? Right. You can't eat, you have to fast, and then you got to drink that drink so it cleans out your whole body. Now, has anyone ever not done what they were supposed to do and went to the doctor? Did anybody have that problem? Okay, and did they let you do the colonoscopy? They did? Okay, but they do a different procedure, let's just put it that way. That there's a sense that when God is cleaning us out, part of what fasting does is it really cleans you out. It cleans out you not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And it may be sort of a gross example, but what God is trying to do is clean us from the inside out. And often when you've ever had a surgery, if anyone's ever had a surgery, I know colonoscopy is not a surgery, but if you've ever had a surgery, they also tell you to fast, right? And I'm not a doctor, so I couldn't tell you the exact reason, other than I know that they don't want stuff in there while they're doing it, and they don't want gas and bloating and all these other things that can happen. But I really do believe that God wants to do surgery on some of you. And the reason he wanted you to fast today is because he wants to remove something that is not good for you. Right? So fasting, it always comes right before a surgery. And the reason I think that's important is because fasting, it isn't just something that you practice. It's meant to be practiced in real life. So there are things to fast for. You can look at the things that are happening in the world and the things that are going on in the world, and you could be worried about them and you can pray and fast. But fasting is really meant to give you more time to pray. It's meant to kind of afflict yourself on some level so that you're feeling it a little bit more, so that your body starts matching with your emotions. But also I think it prepares you for the surgery that comes next. And the surgery that comes next is God then removing. We talked about it last night. If you were here, it was really fun to watch Michael carry that trash out on his shoulder, that he didn't just take the garbage out, he took the garbage out, like he took it out, and we threw all of our garbage, and most of you came up, I think almost everybody, maybe everybody, came up and threw something in the garbage that they felt like the Lord wanted to get rid of, and then he took the garbage out, which is what Yom Kippur is about. Now, I told you last night that I was going to tell you who to vote for this coming up. So write this down. Okay, you need to vote for somebody who cares about the rich, but also cares about the poor, right? You need somebody who cares about immigrants, but also cares about the law. You need somebody who cares about your protection, but also cares about the world, right? You need somebody who has good character and loves their wife and has never cheated or lied or stolen. Okay, I know some of you are starting to go, well, okay, now you're disqualifying everybody. And that's the whole point, is you are never going to find on this earth a person that you can vote for that will ever be as good as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And it's important to remember as we go into this season, because I know we're pushing the holidays up to the season, that the Bible never commands you to vote. It's a civil responsibility, but it's not the same thing as a command of God. And I'm not telling you to vote or not vote. What I'm saying to you is we have to put earthly things on earth and heavenly things in heaven. Right? And it's important, right? And now you can vote you need to vote how you feel like the Lord is telling you to vote. And I'm not telling you, again, I don't like to talk about politics. And the reason is because my degree is not in politics. My degree is, I have lots of degrees in theology, right? So I can tell you about theology. But what I can tell you is, the Bible doesn't tell you to vote for it, but I do think that what Yeshua does is he does say things like, it doesn't really matter as much as you think it matters. And I'll give you an example. When they come to Yeshua and they ask him, who are you supposed to pay taxes to? Are you supposed to pay taxes or not? And Yeshua says, well, let me see the coin. And he looks at the coin and he goes, well, Caesar's face is on this, so I would say give it back to him. Now, some people think that means that Yeshua is commanding you to pay taxes. What I think he's really doing is saying, you can pay all the taxes you want. It doesn't really matter, because this isn't where you live. This isn't really where you're from, and it's not really where you're going. So if it's his money, give him his money back. Right? It belongs to him. And at the end of the day, that money doesn't matter when you're looking at the world through heavenly eyes. Right? That when you have to look at, remember, the prayer that Yeshua taught us wasn't in heaven as it is on earth. It's on earth as it is in heaven. Right? So heaven is the destination. And part of our identity is we have to realize that, we're not really from where we live. We are passersby. We are dust. We are people who we're renters. Right? We are not permanent residents of this place. We have an inheritance and a place and a purpose that's bigger than Illinois. And it's bigger than the United States for sure. And the gospel is not an American thing. That the gospel has been going way before America was even a thing. I mean, you talk about oldies and and youngies like Neil was talking about. It's always interesting when you go to places, especially places like in Israel, and you see like a wall that's 3,000 years old, and you think, well, the oldest thing in America, other than native things, right, Native American things, was like we say, oh, it's almost 300 years old, and people are like, wow, that's not really that old, right? That the reason I say this is because we don't even realize how tangled we are in worldly things. And I said it last night. A good example is I really believe that the Lord is going to come back soon. I think the Lord is going to come back soon because I see all of the things he told us that would happen, and they're happening faster and faster, and they're getting closer together. And he calls them birth pains. And normally when the contractions get closer, it means that we're almost going to have a baby, right? That we're getting closer and closer. So as we get closer and closer, things are not really going to get better and better, right? The way that the scripture lays it out is the world doesn't get better and then the Lord comes back. The world gets worse, and then the Lord sees it and then has to judge. He has to come and say, okay, this is what... So we spend so much time in worldly things. And I said last night, I gave you this example, that I believe the Lord's coming back, and I hope he comes back before this election so that I don't have to vote. But because I think it's nonsense, honestly, when I look at what's happening in the world. I think the world is crazy. I think the world has gone nuts. And I think there are a lot of sheep, that wolves that are dressed like sheep. And I don't think you can tell the difference, because I sure can't. And that's the problem, right? Is that we can't put our trust in a human being. We can't put our trust in a nation. Ultimately, we're not even from here. This isn't where we are from, and this isn't where we're going. And I think we have to rebrand our identity as people who have an inheritance that's someplace else. That we are really citizens of heaven. Now, you can be a dual citizen. Somebody said this morning, you can be a dual citizen. But like I said last night, I could tell that I was off a little bit when I thought, man, the Lord is going to come back soon, but man, what should I do with my 401k? Right? Like, should I spend all that money? If he's coming back, right? There was a famous theologian preacher. He was one of the heads of the Christian Missionary Alliance, and then became also one of the heads of the Assemblies of God. His name was Blackstone. He was a big Zionist before Zionists were called Zionists, and he gave a lot of money to what became the modern state of Israel. And he was so convinced that, being a premillennial dispensationalist, that the rapture was going to happen, and he was so convinced that it was going to happen soon that he took his millions of dollars that his family had left him, and he gave it to a man named Brandeis. And that became Brandeis University. Because according to his theology, Jewish people have to go through the tribulation where Christians get raptured. So, I know it's a little funny. So he gave all his money to the Jewish people so that they could live through the rapture. The rapture didn't happen, and now Brandeis is a huge university. In fact, my kid's orthodontist went to Brandeis, which is, I think, hilarious when you think about it. They have an orthodontist school at Brandeis? Okay, so, but that was all because of somebody who looked at what was happening in the world and then made a decision, like, I don't even need all this money. And I think probably made a premature decision to give all his money away. So it's important that when you look at the world, we have to make sure that we know what our identity is, because the world is going to tell us what our identity is, and people are going to tell us, and politicians are going to tell us, and your job is going to tell you, and right? I mean, people are going to give you all sorts of labels, but at the end of the day, we need to become people who know where we're actually headed. And if we know where we're headed, then it doesn't, doing things here on earth, you kind of go, they don't seem to matter as much. Like, at the end of the day, whoever wins, it's probably going to be a mess. And we know it's not going to end on November 4th. I'll tell you that. That's for sure not what's going to happen. But as believers, we need to stay unified. We need to stay together. We need to stay, no matter what our beliefs are, no matter even if we disagree politically, we bend a knee to a different king. Which means whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or like a Green Party or something, right? You still have to find a way to love one another, because the command is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't say, and only love your neighbor if they agree with you politically or if they're in your little echo chamber on Facebook. Right? It doesn't say that. So somehow believers have to figure out how, and I think the way that we do it is by focusing on heaven. Right? I love what Leanne said at the beginning. It's nice to meet you, people who I'm going to be with for the rest of eternity. Right? I thought that was such a cool idea. Like, it's like, yeah, this is our family. This is the people we're going to be with. These are the people that we have to work hard at being together with, because in the future, this is us. Right? The world will be different. The world will be recreated. There will be a judgment day, and God will judge rightly. And these are the people that we're going to be with forever. So if we're going to be together forever, we're going to have to figure out what to do when all the politics are gone. When there's only one king on the throne and we don't have anything to argue about anymore, what's going to happen to all those 24-hour news channels? There's not going to be anything to talk about. Right? We're going to have nothing to argue about anymore, because there won't be any missiles flying into Israel like there is right now, literally right now. Right? There won't be any wars. There won't even be rumors of wars. There won't be any more earthquakes. There won't even be a sun and a moon to argue about whether it's a sign or not. Right? Think about that. Think about all the things we argue about as believers and all the things we argue about with people who are not believers. All of those things one day will be gone. So then what do we have left? We have each other and the Lord. And I think we can start practicing that now if we figure out how to live in heaven before we even get there. Does that make sense? So we're going to be in Genesis. I know that was a huge introduction. But I told you who to vote for. So now you need to vote for Yeshua. Okay, so when Joseph was dying, I want to show you a very interesting thing. And I think you can think of it as, if we've been talking about identity, and I've been trying to think about how to say it this way, and the only way I could say it is carried bones identity. That if you know that you don't belong where you belong, and you live beyond your lifetime, like you think about, it's not about you, and it's not about this moment. It's about the future, and it's about our children and our children's children. Then what ends up happening is you say, listen, whatever I had to do here, when I was renting in Illinois, technically, right? I need to have my mind set on the kingdom, which means that when I die, I would hope that one of you would carry my bones out of this place, because I'm not really from here. Does that make sense? So there's this thing, this funny story that's toward the end of Genesis, where Joseph's father is dying. And it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then Jacob has 12 sons, and one of them is Joseph. And he thought Joseph was dead. Joseph went down. It turns out Joseph was sold by his brothers. They have dysfunction in their family. If you don't believe that God understands dysfunction, then just read Genesis. I mean, it's like he understands dysfunctional families. So they go down to Egypt. Joseph and his brothers get separated because his brothers sold him to his cousins, and then his cousins sold him to somebody in the Egyptian court. And he gets into all sorts of trouble, ends up in jail, not for anything of his own, but then the Lord uses him over and over. You guys know this story, right? You've heard of Joseph, right? He dreams a lot. Dreams get him in trouble. But miraculously, they're reconciled. And not only are they reconciled, but he gets to see his father again, who he thought was dead, and then Jacob gets to see his son, who he thought was dead. And we see this resurrection motif. But then at the end of the story, there's this funny little interaction, and it goes like this. It says, then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And then Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Now this is really an interesting thing, because there is no Jewish tradition that you make your parents into mummies. Right? That's not a Jewish tradition. right? Anybody ever hear that one? Like it's like maybe it's a weird, maybe the Karaites do it. I don't think they do, right? Because they're from Egypt, right? But notice what he's doing is he's been living most of his life now in Egypt. He's part of the Egyptian politics. He's second only to Pharaoh, really, at this point. And he decides when his father dies, he's going to use the Egyptian technique of preserving a body. Now that to me is, you go, that's kind of funny. Why didn't he stand up? Now there is a time and a place for everything, but he could have done like Daniel, and he could have said, you know what? We don't mummify our bodies. We sit Shiva. That's how we do it. We cover our mirrors, and then by the way, that's kind of made up too. But he could have said, that's our tradition, and he could have fought against the tradition of Egypt, but he doesn't fight the tradition of Egypt. He goes along with it. Not only that, he takes Jacob and makes him into a mummy. He embalms him and puts him in a coffin. And we know this because it even tells us how much time in the next verse. It says, now 40 days were required for it, for such is the period requiring for embalming, and the Egyptians wept for him for 70 days. Now when you look in Egyptian writings, that's exactly how long it takes. It takes 40 days to embalm the person, to turn them into a mummy, like to mummify them. And then it takes another 30 days to do another 30 days of mourning. So they do 70 days of mourning. Right? So it's interesting to me that he's doing something culturally that belongs to Egypt, but I have a feeling that he didn't care that much. And you'll see as we go through that he said, listen, we live in Egypt, let's do some Egyptian stuff. Now, if it was against the Lord or against Scripture, he might have not done it. If he had had some sort of interaction with the Torah and thought this was not something I can do. But in this case, he goes, you know what? This is the Egyptian way. We'll do it the Egyptian way. I feel like this every time we do a funeral here in Illinois. When we were in New York, we had different traditions. In Illinois, they have this, I think, a weird tradition. The first time I saw it, I thought they were making a mistake. But because the grave, and particularly in a Jewish grave, has to be filled, for some reason in Illinois, they back a truck up right at the end of the funeral, and they dump truck the dirt into the grave. The first time I saw that, because first time I did a funeral here, I told them to stop because I was like, what are you guys doing? Because in New York, we never ever would anybody ever do that. Right? We still dig, we still fill the grave the same way that the grave needs to be filled. But the truck comes later when everyone's gone. But for some reason here, and then I said, why does this happen? They said, well, we have a union and these guys got to get paid and they get paid by the hour. It sounded very Chicago. Right? They were like, this guy gets paid by the hour, and it's like, and so they have to get it done, and I'm like, so this isn't really a Jewish tradition, it's sort of a Chicago thing. And then also, if you know, that when you have to pay for a funeral, you're not just paying for a coffin, you have to pay for a cement box to put the coffin in, because we have rules, right? All of a sudden, they're saying, well, this costs, you got to pay for this, you got to pay for this. And every time it happens, everybody gets really frustrated and angry because they go, why are we paying for all this? Where in Jewish tradition, we just put them in a pine box and we bury them. And then we have to follow all these rules that the government's created to make burials incredibly more difficult. And I have a feeling that you go, look, if we're heavenly minded, you go, this is just the way it is here in Illinois. This isn't where we actually belong. So on some level, I can go, you know what? Not a big deal. Bring the dump truck in. I know it's weird for me, but life is more important, and the traditions are not as important as the future that we have, right? That if we're heavenly minded, you can go, it's not that big a deal because this isn't where they're staying anyway. In our theology, this isn't where they end up, right? This isn't where the person stays. This is just their temporary place until the resurrection. Right? So then you go, well, how nice does it have to be? Do I have to pick out a nice tree? Does it have to be a nice spot? Does it have to have a view? And then all of a sudden you go, you know what? This is a temporary thing. If we're heavenly minded, right? So I think he's doing the same thing. Now what's interesting is when Aaron dies, they do the same thing. They mourn for 30 days. When Moses dies, they do the same thing. Why? Because they've been living in Egypt for 400 years. That's the way that they bury people there. They're just doing it the Egyptian way. It says, when the days of mourning had passed, this is verse 4, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your sight, please speak to Pharaoh, saying. Now notice, he's second to Pharaoh, but he's still following the policies because he's going to people who are in Pharaoh's family and honorably asking them to ask Pharaoh, which is like the Egyptian way to do it. So he knows the Egyptian culture, he's staying within the Egyptian culture, and he's working sort of through it, but he asked for a favor. And he says, my father made me swear. Now notice, this must have been an important moment for Joseph, because Joseph thought his father was dead, and Jacob thought Joseph was dead, and now he's planning his funeral, and now he's in charge of his funeral because the brothers really seemed to not be capable at the time. Has anyone been through that before? right? Where you had to take care of the funeral because your family just was not capable. It's terrible. It's one of the hardest things that people do, and people fight a lot about it, right? And you'll see that they do here too. He says, my father made me swear, behold, I'm about to die. In my grave which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, please let me go and bury my father, and I will return. It actually says, and I will teshuv, I will turn back. Right? So notice he's saying, I know that I have now fully in Egyptian culture. Now notice, he could have said, could you let my family go? Maybe the Exodus the whole book of Exodus wouldn't have happened if Joseph said, could you do me a favor and let my family go back to Canaan? That's not what he says. What he says is I'm going to bring my father to Canaan because he made me promise, because he's not really from here. And the promise that God made for us is in Canaan. So is it okay if we bury him there where the promise is? And I think that that's, for us, the promised land, the heavenly principle, right? The inheritance that's beyond where we are. Could you please bury me there? Now, I know my dad has asked me, this is, I think, really funny. He said, could you please sneak me into Israel? And I said, I don't think that's a way to sneak a body into Israel. And he said, well, why don't you cremate me and put me in like a tube and just put it in your pocket and then go to Israel. And then when you get to the Mount of Olives, just pour me on the top. That way, I'm the first one to see Yeshua when he steps on the foot of the Mount of Olives. That's what he told me, right? Now, that's heavenly thinking, right? I want to see him first. So if I die before that happens, get me to the top of the mountain. Yes. That's what he's saying, right? That's what Jacob is saying there's a promise that is beyond where we currently live. And I think that's the message. There is a promise and there's an inheritance that goes beyond where we currently live. Not only in Illinois, but in this nation, right? We can worry and obsess about all the things that are happening, but also we're not really from here and we don't belong here and we're just passing through on a way to someplace better. Right? So ultimately, at the end of the day, we can't put our trust in fleshly things, in human things, in earthly things, because those things are going to wither and fall apart, and they're going to degrade, and they're going to fall down ultimately. When really we should be putting our investment and our thinking and our future into the kingdom, which is unshakable. So Jacob's saying, "Please bring me to where the promise is. I don't want to die in Egypt. And if I die here, could you bring me out and bury me someplace else?" That's what Jacob says to Joseph. And Joseph then now has to plan the funeral. And then if anybody's having to plan a funeral, I had a friend of mine, we called him Uncle Mark. He died on a trip, and they had to somehow get his body back to Philadelphia. And he was like overseas. And it was this huge ordeal to move his body. It was terrible, but that's what they're asking him to do. He's saying, can you imagine your dad saying, listen, I need you to move me to Israel. Right? If I die, take my body to Israel. You're thinking that it's already hard enough to take your body to like Jewish funeral homes, or like Dignity Funeral. That's already hard enough. But could you imagine if it's like bring me there? That's what he's saying. And they're in Egypt. It's pretty far away. And by the way, they didn't have planes and trains and automobiles. They had to go there like on cart. So when it happens, Joseph follows the Egyptian tradition, and we know that you'll see as we keep going that it's even more obvious to everybody else. So then Pharaoh says to him, "Get up and bury your father, as he has made you swear." Now this is an interesting interaction because it's very much like Moses talking to Pharaoh. And then later we find out that Pharaoh forgets, the Pharaoh changes, and that Pharaoh doesn't remember Joseph. And that starts the Exodus story. So then Pharaoh said, "Go and bury your father." So Joseph went to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of the household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. So notice, he has not just a funeral. All of Egypt says, we'll go too. So then all of the heads of Egypt go with them. It's like this massive royal funeral for Jacob. I mean, think about that. That Jacob, who's really just at the time, has 12 sons that are really dysfunctional and is a nomadic kind of existence in the land of Canaan and only bought a little part of land. The inheritance has not fully even been redeemed yet. And Pharaoh is sending all of these dignitaries to his funeral. It's pretty spectacular when you think about that. So Joseph went up with the servants and all the household of Joseph and his brothers and his father's household, and they left only the little ones and their flocks and their herds in the land of Goshen. So notice, they're going back to Egypt, right? I don't know about you, but where's the conversation? I keep wondering, where's the conversation? I would imagine somebody like Judah would have said, hey, listen, if we do this funeral, we can just stay there. right? But then they're like, no, we're going to leave our kids in Egypt because we know we're coming back, right? So they're going to go back to where they're from, or where they think they're from. And you'll see that the difference between Joseph's brothers and Joseph is that Joseph's brothers are thinking about what's happening to them right now, and they're thinking about only what's happening to them, and both Jacob and Joseph are thinking about what's going to happen to them in the future. And that's the difference. So, verse 9 says, they all went up both with chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there for great and sorrowful lamentation, and observed 7 days of mourning for his father. Now, this is the verse, if you ask rabbis, where we get the tradition of sitting Shiva, right? Shiva just means 7, that you sit for 7 days, that it actually comes from this passage, which I think is funny because they actually mourn for him for 70 days plus 7. He gets 77 days of mourning, which is pretty honorable on some level. But they're doing kind of the Egyptian thing, and then when they get to Canaan, they go, okay, let's do the Jewish thing, right? They're figuring out, and if you have lived in this world as a believer or as a Jewish person, you know what it's like to kind of have your like public persona and then your private persona. The public persona is, yeah, I'm cool with whatever's happening, that's all right, yeah, I believe that, yeah. Then you go home and you sit Shiva and nobody sees, right? And you have kind of like this private part of you that the world doesn't see because maybe it's too much for everybody else because you don't really want your friends and your neighbors to know how religious you really are, right? And then you have your public persona, which is like your, what do you say to people when you actually interact with them? Some of you have that, some of you don't. So they go up, but notice they go to this place. Now, what's interesting about this, just as a side note, is if you were going to go visit this place today, there is a cave called the Cave of Patriarchs, and it's in Hebron, and Hebron is in the West Bank. Now, just as a side note, all of the patriarchs that are mentioned in the Bible are buried either in Gaza or the West Bank or Nablus. Nablus is the headquarters for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The patriarchs are buried in Hebron, which is in the West Bank, and some are in the Gaza, what is called today the Gaza Strip. And it's interesting that there's a group of people who claim to be there first, but there are graves from our ancestors that are right in the middle, that were there thousands of years before anybody else got there. Just as a side note, okay? Now notice, it's in those places. It's also somewhat ironic to me that the patriarchs are buried in places that we can't go. So Egyptian to them that they actually called the place Abel Mitzrayim, which is really like the threshing floor of the Egyptians, or the field of the Egyptians. So they actually named that. It's actually, you can still find this place. Or you can look, if you put this into a Google map, there's like a little thrift store that's right near there, and then there's like, and you'll see like where Abraham and the other people are buried. It's like this, and it's kind of funny that in a modern day, there's still this place that is named after the Egyptians because this Jewish funeral was so Egyptian. And to me, that's kind of like the way we live, right? We are citizens of heaven, but most of us are also like Americans, and we do American stuff. And sometimes we do American stuff, right? Sometimes we do not just American, we do American, right? We have traditions that we have developed here. And if you want to read a good book, there's a professor from NYU. His name is Sarna. He wrote a book on American Judaism. And if you want to see just sort of the quirkiness of American Judaism, do you know that we didn't have a rabbi? We had Jewish people in the United States starting in the 1600s, but we didn't have a rabbi till the 1840s. We didn't have one. So we came up with some really interesting things that we like to do. That's why the celebration of Purim has become so big in the United States. It's our main. It's big because for 200 years that was the one we did because we didn't need a rabbi to do it. And it's become so big that you'll see if you look at old posters about it, they'll say, "Hey, come to this festival in the Masonic Lodge." And then we have more tradition as Jewish people with secular things like the Masons than we do with the Torah and the prophets and the writings in America, right? I know some people say, why do we play organ on Yom Kippur? Well, you might not know this, but before the 1800s, there were organs in every synagogue. And it was only until somebody said, this feels like too much like a church, that they stopped putting organs in synagogues. There are books and books and books of organ music that are like ancient organ music, right? That are hundreds of years old, that are meant for synagogue worship, which is what we used last night. And we don't play it anymore because somebody said it felt too much like something else, right? If you looked at the people in the 1800s, they all wore the same clothes, both rabbis and priests. The buildings all look the same. The insides look the same. It wasn't until the 1840s, really the end of like the Civil War in the 1850s, 1860s, and toward the end of the 19th century that people started saying, maybe we should put some Hebrew on the wall. Maybe we should stand out a little bit. You can see this in the movie The Frisco Kid, if you want. That when the rabbi shows up with his Torah, and he's carrying this little Torah, and he just like literally had to spend all his time with Harrison Ford and just going through the wilderness to get to San Francisco, and he gets there, and all the Jewish guys come out with top hats and canes, and they're like, what are you doing here? You don't look very Jewish. You know, and he's like, what? I brought the Torah. And it's like, they can't believe, right? That's literally how it was. So what happens is that whenever we live someplace too long, we start taking on the culture of the place that we live. And we become so tied to that culture, we start living on earth instead of living in heaven. And we start living as if we don't have an inheritance. We start living as if our inheritance is this place. Right? We start living as if our home is more important than our home that actually is in Jerusalem. In the heavenly Jerusalem, in the heavenly places. We start living. See, so sometimes our identity, and the reason I know this is because you can just look at what's happening in the election, and you can look about how people who love each other fight so much, right? If you want, I've seen more people fight, people who I know have loved each other for many, many years, fight more about this upcoming election than anything else in the world. And all that says to me is, you're thinking too much about this stuff. Because this isn't actually where we belong. Now, I'm not saying don't vote. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have a civil responsibility to be a part of what's happening in the culture that you're a part of. But you also, at the same time, have to have a balance for that thing is not as important as the heavenly thing. Amen. And ultimately, where we're headed and the king that we are going to have is so much better than any king on earth. Amen. Any politician, any king, any president, any prime minister, they will come and go. But the King of Kings is forever, and the Lord of Lords is the one who really sits on the throne. So ultimately, believers and in God have had to figure out how to stick together no matter what the crisis has been. And this is just a new crisis. And we have to figure out how to get through that crisis unified and loving one another and finding a way to find common ground. And the only way to find common ground is to recognize that we're all actually a family, that we belong together, and we're going to live together forever. So if we're going to live together forever, we better figure out how to be nice to each other because this is who your neighbor is. Look, right? Look at the person next to you and say, hey, you're my neighbor. Right? So if these are the people that you're going to, we better figure it out now, right? As opposed to getting so upset about who's going to be the next or what's going to happen next or what's going to happen if. Because the problem is no matter who wins, we still have a problem. Because the world still is focused on itself, and it's still focused on itself at a speed that we can't even control anymore. We are so self-centered as a culture that we want things immediately brought to us right now, in this moment. I was watching a comedian talk about how, if you might have saw this last week, but he was saying that he likes to order DoorDash, but he likes to double up because he wants his ice cream from one place, but he wants his McDonald's from another place, and he's talking about how he's going to get, right? He was like, I want it right now. And then he says, I was so embarrassed because both the DoorDash guys came at the same time. Because I was ordering from two different places, but I wanted both things, so I had it coming, and he was talking about how embarrassing it was. So he was like, now I try to order them so they're offset, so that one comes and then the other one comes, and they don't have to bump into each other. He said at one point, the McDonald's guy had to move out of his driveway so the Dairy Queen guy could get in. He said, that's how much our culture, right? Think about how much that we're so used to instant and right now that it's hard for us to think about the future. In fact, for some of us, the future is only anxiety. Because we're so caught up in what's going to happen now that the future just looks like chaos. But not if we have one true king. Not if we know our identity. If you know your identity, then the waves and the storms can come, but you'll be built on solid ground. That if your identity is in Yeshua, then the waves that have come in the past will pass right on by. Right? And you will have a solid place to land every single time. And not only that, you'll have a community of other people who are also standing along next to you, not being tossed back and forth. Does that make sense? Okay, so notice we call this place the place of, literally the place of Egypt. So verse 12, it says, thus the sons did for him as they had charged him, for the sons carried him off to Canaan and buried him in a cave in the field before Mamre, which is where Abraham is buried. And then verse 14 says, and they buried their father Joseph, returned to Egypt with his brothers who had gone up with him to bury their father. So they go back to Egypt, right? When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, now here's the conflict. And we don't have to go into this whole time because I don't want to take too much time. But they essentially say, now that our dad's dead, you're probably going to kill us. And then Joseph says, no, you're thinking too much about the earth, right? Ultimately, he says, please, they said, please forgive. I beg you the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, for they did wrong. And now please forgive the transgressions of your servants of God, your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. He wept because he realized that they were thinking only about themselves and only about what was happening to them. And they thought, our father's dead now, so now you're going to kill us because of what we did to you. And Joseph says, no, I'm not thinking about the earth. I'm thinking about what was God doing? What was God doing? So then he said, the brothers came and fell down before him. Verse 19 says, but Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? Am I in God's place? Like essentially, am I God? He says, as for you, what you meant for evil against me, God meant it for good in order to bring about the present result, to preserve many people alive. He's saying, I could see God moving even in the midst of the chaos. Do you see? So Joseph is different than his brothers because Joseph, the way God used Joseph and the way he saw his father die, and he saw this heavenly principle, he was able to say, listen, it's bigger than our current predicament. What we're doing and what God has called us to is bigger than just us. It's bigger than the thing that we're currently going through. It's not even really about us at all. It's about the future, and it's about what's going to happen to Israel, and it's about what's going to happen to our people, and it's about what's going to happen to the world through our people. Because he knew what his identity was, even though he got it beaten out of him by his brothers, and by his cousins, and by Pharaoh, and by Potiphar's wife, and by the jailers. Right? He went through a lot of difficult things, but in the midst of it, he maintained one thing, that no matter what happens to us in this current age, we have a future place that's better. Now, I don't know if you guys know, you guys heard Joanna sing last night that lament song. And I don't know if you know that her father had a massive heart attack this week. And when they got to the hospital, the doctor literally came out and said, I don't know if I can do this surgery. Like, you need to know that this is bad. And we wouldn't even do this surgery. This was like 2 nights ago. So as she's about to sing this song about lament, she's thinking about her father dying. And her father, right, also has been struggling with dementia. So he goes back and forth into his own reality and remembering things and not remembering things. And whenever somebody struggles with somebody who's going through dementia, you get worried. Do they even know the Lord? Do they know where they're at? Do they know me? You get worried about who they are and what their identity is. But from the minute he was in the hospital to the time he went into surgery, he kept saying, I know who my God is. I know who my God is, and I know who I am, and I know what he's about. And then he looked at her and he said, right when they went into surgery, right before they went into surgery, he looked at her and said, is this it? And she said, I think it might be it, Dad, but I know where you're headed. And he said, me too. I trust in the Lord. Right? That's heavenly purpose. Right? That's not thinking about the current situation or the thing that you're in, even though it was drastic, even though it was an emergency, even though it was a surgery that the doctor himself came out and said, literally, I'm pretty sure. Now, doctors, I don't know if you know this, but doctors don't normally come out and go, I'm not good at this particular surgery. They don't usually tell you that. Like, I don't think I can pull this off. Usually they go, no problem, we've done this 100 times, and then they mess it up, right? But normally, so he pretty much came out and said, this isn't going to work. He's too old, he's had too much heart disease, that we're going to do a surgery that we don't even think is going to work, and I don't think I can even do it. Now, he said that in front of them. Now, for somebody who has no hope, who doesn't have a relationship with the Lord, that would be terrifying, right? That's just the end. But for somebody who has a relationship with God, then all of a sudden you're going, no, there's more to this. So when he said this is it, there was a part of him that was okay with this being it. Now, miraculously, the doctor came out super excited after the surgery, like doctors often do, and they said, I don't even know how I did it. Right? I mean, they come out and they're shocked. Right? This happened years ago with the Gasleys when we were with Talia Gasley. If you remember, she had cancer and the cancer was wrapped around a nerve, and the nerve was in the back of her leg. So they said, if we take this cancer out, it's going to paralyze her leg, and she's just going to have a floppy foot the rest of her life. And they said, and the doctor came out. He was super. He said, I'm the best at this. You're at the best hospital. I know I can do it. Right? He was super excited. And when he came out, he says, I've never had a surgery go that well. He goes, I don't know what was happening out here, but when I took it, I just peeled it, and it came off like magic. And we were like, no, not like magic. We've been praying for like 12 hours straight. Right? That God has intervened. You look at what's happening in Israel and the fact that there were never before has there ever been a country sending missiles at another country, right? Rockets is one thing, but missiles from one country to never ever have there been like 200 missiles shot at another country the way that Iran shot at Israel. And somehow, miraculously, despite the fact that the people who created the Iron Dome said this is not 100% effective, that some will get through, it was 100% effective. So much so that the people in Israel, particularly the Jewish people, are going, I don't know if I believed in God before, but I believe in God now. Right? There's a revival that is starting to happen because when you stop thinking about yourself and you stop thinking about what's happening to you currently, it's not about you and it's not about this moment. It's about what God is doing through his people and in his kingdom. We have to become kingdom-minded people, which means that we have to think about what's going to happen to our bones because we don't belong here. Do you follow me? And that's what Jacob did. And then you'll see that Joseph, when he gets into a conflict with his brothers, is able to say, guys, there's a bigger plan here. We don't have to fight. You guys need to know that I'm not only going to take care of you, I'm going to take care of your family because our family matters to the world. He's thinking on a heavenly level. Right? All of a sudden, there's a purpose and a plan that goes beyond what their current circumstances are. And I know for some of you, God wants to do surgery today because He wants you to fast so that He can put you to sleep so that when you wake up, that flesh, that earthly thing, that thing that's tied to this earth, He wants to remove it so that you can become heavenly minded, kingdom focused believers in what God can do, not just what's happening to you. So then they say, please forgive. Now, look at this. Now here's the end. It says, now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years, which, by the way, in Egyptian culture means that he was honored above most. Now, I think he probably really was 110, but it's a whole different discussion. You can come to Torah Club. We can argue about numerology in the Bible. But 110 is still an Egyptian cultural thing. So he lived a perfect amount of life. And he was able to see the third generation of Ephraim's sons and the sons of Machir and the sons of Manasseh. And they were born on his knees, meaning that he adopted them into his family. That he saw other tribes and he adopted those tribes into his family. So not only were they reconciled, but they were reconciled as a family on a level that most of us have never seen. That literally they took care of each other's kids. And then he says to his brothers, I'm about to die. Now this is how you can see that it's been passed on from generations. He says, I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land that he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Look at what he's doing. He's saying, our family has gotten a promise from God. And even though we've had to stay here for a long time, and even though we're dying here, right, there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to die in Illinois. This is not where I belong. If you had asked me 20 years ago where I was going to die, I would tell you I'm 100% going to die in a hostel created for missionaries in the city of Jerusalem, which maybe is still where I'm headed. Who knows? But there's a pretty good chance that all my stuff is here. All my family is here. In fact, my parents came here. There's a pretty good chance that they're going to die in Illinois. They don't know, but we're planning it already. Right? It's better to plan it in advance, I promise. It's cheaper, too. But there's a good chance that they are going to die here. But I'm telling you right now that I promise that my dad will be in Jerusalem.
That's right.
Whether his body is buried here, right? Whether his body is buried here, he will make it to the promised land. Right? The same thing is true for Moses. You think about Moses couldn't make it, but then when Yeshua transfigured on the top of the Mount of Transfiguration, who was there? Moses in the promised land. Because he didn't care that he was dying on a mountain in Jordan, when he knew that his future was going to be in the kingdom of God in Israel. So think about that. When we are kingdom-minded people, then we're expecting that our bones aren't going to stay here. This isn't where we end up. This is just where we're temporarily stored until that great and terrible day. And that to me is super exciting because then all of a sudden I go, maybe I don't care as much about paying taxes. Or maybe I don't care as much about who ultimately is going to be the next whatever, because at the end of the day, it's not where we're headed. Which means that we don't have to attack one another. We don't have to fight with one another. We don't have to be at each other's throats about it. Because ultimately, now I think we used to, by the way, we used to be able to have conversations. I don't know what happened. You used to be able to even disagree with somebody. But these days, everybody is insulted and offended, and you can't say anything without offending anybody. And even within believers, and I think the Lord wants to change that. Believers should be the ones that can have a conversation with anybody. We should be the ones who can hear anybody talk about anything and still find a way to bring the gospel into it. Amen. Right? The ones who believe in God should be the ones who reflect God. But somehow we become just like everybody else. If we end up just reflecting it just like everybody else, then where is the holiness? Where's the difference? Right? And ultimately, we have to be kingdom-minded people who know that our bones don't belong here. So notice, it actually says in Hebrews, when it calls Joseph a hero, it says that when he was about to die, it interprets it, says, he saw the Exodus, and he knew that it was not about the moment with his brothers on his deathbed, that it was about God bringing his people out of Egypt into the promised land. And he made them promise that they would take his bones. Now, Joseph dies. And it's not for a long time, right, that Moses takes his bones. And at the end of the Exodus story, Moses takes his bones and buries them. And he's buried right between Ebal and Gerizim. I don't know if you guys know this. The burial place for Joseph is right next to the city of Nablus, which is the headquarters of the PLO, which again is a whole other conversation, right? But that's the same place where there's a well. That's the same place where Yeshua talked to a woman and she said, what about on this mountain? And he says, one day the mountains aren't going to matter. One day the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is going to step down, and it won't matter that you still worship on Gerizim and we worship in Jerusalem. That the place itself won't matter as much. Right? That's the same place that Joseph is buried. That's the same place where Moses lined up the people of Israel and said, listen, when you get there, line up some on Ebal and some on Gerizim, and I want you to look at the difference between life and death. I want you to choose between following the Lord and not following the Lord. And choosing life, and don't choose the things that lead to death. Because if you choose the things to death, then you die. But if you choose the things of life, then you will surely live, and you will live beyond your actual life, not just in your memory, not just in your friends and family, but because we believe in resurrection. Amen. This is the same reason why the book of Hebrews calls Abraham a hero, because when he was going to sacrifice his son Isaac, he knew and believed so much in resurrection that he told all of his servants, hey guys, we're going to go worship and we'll be right back, even though God had told him to sacrifice his son. See, when you are heavenly minded, the current situation that you're in doesn't matter as much as you think it does, because this isn't actually where you belong. This is just where you are passing through. The Bible calls us travelers, sojourners. We are like dust in the wind. It's not just a song, it's in the Bible, right? We are literally passing through, is what it says, on our way to the perfect and more perfect kingdom than any of the kingdoms here on earth. And there's a moment that's coming where we will all be standing before the throne of God. And there will be a final judgment day, a final day of atonement. And he will open up the book of life, and you will be confident to know that your name is in there if you put your trust in the Messiah. That we become heavenly minded. That's why we want people to accept the Lord. We don't want people to accept the Lord just so they get saved. We want people to accept the Lord so it transforms their lives and the lives of their families. And it transforms the way they make their decisions. And it transforms the path of your life, because you're no longer worried about the past or anxious about the future. You can live knowing that there is a plan and a purpose and a future, and it doesn't matter where you're from, it matters where you're going. And even though God is super excited about you coming to know him, he's even more excited about the holy version of you that he was trying to create you to be. And we need to become people who are not concerned with where we are, but where our bones are going, which means that it's not even really about us at all. It's about our children. It's about the future. It's about the kingdom.